The phone buzzed against Jeffrey Clark's nightstand at 2:17 in the morning, and he knew without looking that it would be Roy Gonzalez. It had become a pattern over the past 3 weeks, these late-night calls that started with casual conversation and ended with Roy's voice growing soft and vulnerable in the darkness. Jeffrey stared at the ceiling of his apartment, his heart already racing before he even answered, because he knew what was coming next. Roy would ask, in that careful way he had developed, if Jeffrey minded if he came over because he didn't like sleeping alone, and Jeffrey would say yes, even though every fiber of his being screamed that this was dangerous territory for someone who had been harboring feelings for his straight best friend for the better part of 2 years. The phone buzzed again, more insistent now, and Jeffrey reached for it with trembling fingers. Roy's name glowed on the screen, and beneath it was a text message that made Jeffrey's breath catch in his throat. Côte de Belle. Jeffrey closed his eyes and felt that familiar ache spread through his chest, the one that had become his constant companion ever since he realized that what he felt for Roy went far beyond friendship. He typed back quickly before he could lose his nerve. Quote 1. The response came immediately, just a simple quote 2 followed by a heart emoji that Jeffrey stared at for far too long, trying to decipher meaning that probably wasn't there. But to understand how they had arrived at this moment, how Jeffrey had found himself caught in this exquisite torture of almost but not quite, it was necessary to go back 3 months earlier, to the night when everything had shifted between them without either of them fully understanding what was happening. Jeffrey had been grading papers in his small kitchen, red pen moving mechanically across student essays about Shakespeare's sonnets, when Roy had appeared at his door, looking disheveled and lost. His usually perfect hair was messed up, his shirt wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and emotional turmoil. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. This story is about to take you on an emotional journey that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about friendship and love. Roy had just broken up with his girlfriend of 8 months, a perfectly nice woman named Emma Thompson, who worked in marketing and had a laugh like wind chimes. Jeffrey had met her several times at group gatherings, had watched Roy's arm around her waist, had smiled and made polite conversation, while his heart quietly shattered into smaller and smaller pieces. When Roy announced they were over, Jeffrey felt terrible for the relief that flooded through him, followed immediately by guilt for feeling relieved when his best friend was clearly in pain. Quote 3. Roy had explained that night, slumping onto Jeffrey's couch with a beer in his hand. Said I was always somewhere else, even when I was right there with her. Said it felt like I was going through the motions of being her boyfriend without actually being present. Jeffrey had listened, offering the appropriate sympathetic responses while internally cataloging every detail of Roy's appearance. The way his jeans fit just right, the small scar on his chin from a childhood accident, the way his eyes crinkled when he was thinking hard about something. Quote 5. Roy had continued, staring at the ceiling. Jeffrey had wanted to reach out and touch him then, to offer comfort in the most natural way possible, but he had kept his hands wrapped around his own beer bottle and offered words instead. Quote 7. He had said carefully. Quote 8. The irony of giving relationship advice to the person he was desperately in love with wasn't lost on Jeffrey, but it seemed to be his designated role in Roy's life, the supportive friend who listened and offered wisdom while quietly dying inside. That conversation had opened something between them, a new level of intimacy that Jeffrey both craved and feared. Roy started coming over more often, not just for their usual movie nights or casual hangouts, but for deeper conversations about life and love and what it meant to feel truly connected to another person. He would arrive at Jeffrey's apartment after work, sometimes with takeout, sometimes empty-handed, and they would talk until the early hours of the morning about everything and nothing. It was during one of these late-night conversations, about 6 weeks after the breakup, that Roy had asked the question that changed everything. They had been discussing relationships, as they often did, with Roy trying to understand why he seemed incapable of forming the deep emotional connections that everyone else made look so effortless. Jeffrey had been careful to keep his responses neutral and supportive, even as every word felt like a knife turning in his chest. Can I ask you something weird? Roy had said suddenly, turning to face Jeffrey on the couch. They had been sitting at opposite ends, but over the course of the evening, they had gradually moved closer together until their knees were almost touching. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to kiss another guy? Jeffrey's heart had stopped completely. He stared at Roy, trying to read his expression in the dim light from the single lamp they had left on. Roy's face was serious, curious, with none of the joking tone he might have used if this were just idle speculation. Jeffrey realized that his silence had stretched too long, that he needed to respond, but his brain seemed to have short-circuited. I mean, Roy continued, apparently taking Jeffrey's silence as an invitation to elaborate. Jeffrey managed to find his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. Ton ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Jeffrey had seen him make hundreds of times, but which now seemed charged with new significance. Quote 14. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and terror. Jeffrey felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, one step away from either flying or falling. He wanted to tell Roy everything in that moment, wanted to confess that he had been in love with him for 2 years and 4 months, that every day of watching Roy with Emma had been a special kind of torture, that the thought of Roy questioning his sexuality filled Jeffrey with hope so intense it was almost painful. Instead, he said carefully. Roy was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his hands. When he looked up, his eyes found Jeffrey's and held them. I think I might have been, but I never let myself acknowledge it. You know how it is, growing up in a small town, going to a conservative college. It was easier to just assume I was straight and force myself to fit that mold. But lately I've been noticing things, the way certain guys look, the way they move, the way they smell. He paused, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. The way you look when you're concentrating on something, or when you laugh at something you think is really funny. Jeffrey's world tilted on its axis. He stared at Roy, searching his face for any sign that this was some kind of cruel joke. But Roy's expression was completely serious, vulnerable in a way Jeffrey had rarely seen. Roy, he said, and his voice cracked on the single syllable. I know this is probably weird for you, Roy said quickly, apparently misinterpreting Jeffrey's reaction. Quote him. Jeffrey almost laughed at the irony. Roy thought he was straight. Roy was sitting there, confessing his possible attraction to men, and specifically mentioning Jeffrey, while assuming that Jeffrey couldn't possibly reciprocate those feelings. It was so absurd that Jeffrey might have found it funny if it weren't also heartbreaking. Jeffrey said quietly, the words falling into the space between them like stones into still water. Roy went very still. Quote 22. Quote 23. Jeffrey repeated, louder this time. Quote 24. The silence that followed was deafening. Jeffrey watched Roy's face cycle through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been relief. Finally, Roy spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. How long have you known? Since I was 14, maybe 15. Definitely by the time we met in college. Jeffrey's heart was pounding so hard he was sure Roy could hear it. Quote 27. Roy shook his head slowly. Quote 28. Quote 29. Jeffrey said simply. Quote 30. Something shifted in Roy's expression then, a dawning realization that made Jeffrey's breath catch. Quote 31. Roy said carefully. Quote Jeffrey knew he was at another crossroads. He could deflect, could claim he was just offering general wisdom about relationships, or he could tell the truth and risk everything they had built together over the years. He looked at Roy, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that gave him courage. Quote, he said simply, quote, Brick leaned back against the couch, processing this information. Jeffrey could practically see the wheels turning in his head, could imagine him recontextualizing years of friendship through this new lens. Quote 35, Roy said slowly, quoted in, quote, Jeffrey confirmed, quote, Jeffrey said, managing a small smile. Quote, Roy laughed, a sound that was part relief and part hysteria. Quote, John, unquote, Jeffrey said gently. Quote, down. Roy was quiet for a moment, staring at Jeffrey with an intensity that made Jeffrey want to squirm. Quote, 40. Jeffrey nodded, not trusting his voice. Quote 46, Jeffrey's heart stopped. This was it, the moment he had been both dreading and hoping for since the conversation began. Roy was giving him an opening, a chance to either step back into safe territory or leap forward into the unknown. Jeffrey thought about all the nights he had lain awake, imagining what it would be like if Roy felt the same way. All the times he had caught himself staring and had to look away, all the careful distance he had maintained to preserve their friendship. It didn't make me uncomfortable, Jeffrey said carefully. It made me hopeful, which is probably worse. Roy's eyes widened. Quote 49. Jeffrey took a deep breath, knowing that once he said the words, there would be no taking them back. Quote 50. The confession hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Roy stared at Jeffrey, his expression cycling through surprise, understanding, and something that looked remarkably like relief. He asked quietly. Roy closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, there was something different in his gaze. Tosh it, quote Baron, Jeffrey said simply. Quote Tosh, quote find, quote Orange. Roy was quiet for a long time, processing this information. Jeffrey watched him, trying to read his expression, wondering if he had just destroyed the most important relationship in his life. Finally, Roy spoke, his voice soft and uncertain. Quote 58. Jeffrey's breath caught. What do you mean? I mean that every time Emma would do something sweet or funny or thoughtful, I would think about how you would have done it differently, usually better. When she would try to comfort me after a bad day, I would find myself wishing she had your sense of humor or your way of knowing exactly what to say. When we would have deep conversations, I kept thinking about how much more natural and easy it felt when I talked to you. Roy shifted on the couch, turning to face Jeffrey more fully. I told myself it was just because we'd been friends longer, that of course I felt more comfortable with you, but looking back now, I think I was measuring every relationship against what I had with you, and they all came up short. Jeffrey felt like he couldn't breathe. Quote tufted, quote cerdate, Roy said quietly. Quote cern, the words hit Jeffrey like a physical force. He had imagined this moment so many times, but the reality was more overwhelming than any of his fantasies. Roy was looking at him with an expression of such vulnerability and hope that Jeffrey felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. What to Jeffrey asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Quote 60, Roy reached across the space between them and took Jeffrey's hand, intertwining their fingers. The touch sent electricity up Jeffrey's arm, and he had to resist the urge to pull away from the intensity of it. Roy said firmly. Quote 68. Jeffrey stared down at their joined hands, hardly able to believe this was really happening. Roy's thumb was tracing small circles on Jeffrey's knuckles, a gesture so tender and intimate that Jeffrey felt his carefully constructed emotional walls beginning to crumble. Quote 69, Jeffrey asked. Quote 70, Roy admitted. Quote 71. Quote 72, Jeffrey said softly. Quote 73, Roy nodded, then hesitated. Quote 7 of song, quote Jeffrey considered the question seriously. Quote 7, Roy was quiet, absorbing this. Then he said very softly, respond. Quote Jeffrey's heart began to race. Yeah, I keep imagining what your lips would feel like, what you would taste like. I keep wondering if you would be gentle or passionate, if you would let me take my time figuring it out, or if you would take control. Roy's voice had dropped to almost a whisper, and Jeffrey could feel the heat radiating from his body across the small space between them. Quote 81, Jeffrey said carefully. Quote wow, and Roy's eyes searched Jeffrey's face. Quote Hoyan, quote now to Jeffrey assured him. Quote Roy nodded, then took a shaky breath. Quote on, Jeffrey felt his pulse quicken as Roy shifted closer on the couch. They were facing each other now, knees touching, Roy's hand still holding Jeffrey's. Roy's free hand came up to cup Jeffrey's face, his thumb brushing across Jeffrey's cheekbone with infinite tenderness. I can't believe this is happening, Roy murmured, his eyes fixed on Jeffrey's lips. Jeffrey asked, even though the question terrified him. Quote 89, Roy said immediately. Quote 9. And then Roy was leaning in, closing the distance between them with agonizing slowness. Jeffrey held perfectly still, letting Roy set the pace, letting him take control of this moment that would change everything between them. When Roy's lips finally brushed against his, soft and tentative and questioning, Jeffrey felt like every nerve ending in his body had caught fire. The kiss was gentle at first, exploratory, Roy's lips moving against Jeffrey's with careful curiosity. Jeffrey responded with equal tenderness, not wanting to overwhelm or rush, just wanting to show Roy how good this could be. When Roy's tongue traced along Jeffrey's lower lip, Jeffrey opened for him, and the kiss deepened into something more urgent and desperate. Roy made a soft sound against Jeffrey's mouth, part surprise and part pleasure, and Jeffrey felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This was really happening. Roy was kissing him like he meant it, like he had been thinking about it for as long as Jeffrey had been dreaming about it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Roy rested his forehead against Jeffrey's. "Wow," he said softly. "Good wow or bad wow?" Jeffrey asked, though Roy's expression made the answer pretty clear. Quote 93, Roy said, his eyes still closed. Quote 94, Jeffrey smiled, his heart so full he thought it might burst. Quote 90, Roy opened his eyes and looked at Jeffrey with an expression of such wonder and affection that Jeffrey had to resist the urge to kiss him again immediately. Quote 96, Roy asked. Quote 97, Jeffrey said, laughing softly at Roy's enthusiasm. This time when they kissed, there was less hesitation and more certainty. Roy's hands tangled in Jeffrey's hair, and Jeffrey pulled Roy closer until they were pressed together from chest to knee. The kiss was deeper, more passionate, full of months of suppressed longing, finally being allowed expression. When they broke apart again, Roy was smiling so widely that Jeffrey couldn't help but smile back. Roy said. Jeffrey remembered that night vividly. He had been hyper-aware of every casual touch, every moment when Roy's skin had brushed against his. He had gone home and taken a very long, very cold shower. "I remember that night," he said. "I had to leave early because I was afraid I was going to do something stupid." "Like what?" "Like kiss you and in the middle of your living room while you were technically still dating Nema." Roy winced. "God, I feel terrible about that now. I was so confused about what I was feeling, and I was taking it out on her. She deserved better than someone who was falling for his best friend and didn't even realize it." "You couldn't help how you felt," Jeffrey said gently. "And you ended things with her when you realized you couldn't give her what she needed. That's more honest than a lot of people would have been." Roy nodded, but Jeffrey could see the guilt still lingering in his expression. "I just hate that I hurt her because I was too scared or too stupid to understand my own feelings." "Hey," Jeffrey said, tilting Roy's chin up so their eyes met. Roy said simply. Quote one. Jeffrey felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. After 2 years of loving Roy from a distance, of watching him with other people and pretending it didn't hurt, hearing Roy say these words felt like a miracle. "Are you sure?" he asked again, because he needed to be absolutely certain. "Because once we cross this line, there's no going back to the way things were before." "I don't want to go back," Roy said firmly. "I've spent too many years trying to force myself into relationships that never felt right. I'm done pretending to be someone I'm not. I want to be with you, Jeffrey. I want to see where this goes." Jeffrey kissed him then, pouring all of his relief and joy and love into the contact. Roy responded immediately, his arms wrapping around Jeffrey's waist and pulling him closer. They kissed until they were both breathless, until Jeffrey's lips felt swollen and Roy's hair was completely messed up from Jeffrey's fingers running through it. When they finally pulled apart, Roy was looking at Jeffrey with an expression of such tenderness that Jeffrey felt his heart skip a beat. "So what happens now?" Roy asked. "Do we tell people? Do we go on dates? Do we figure out how to be boyfriends instead of best friends?" "We take it one day at a time," Jeffrey said. "We figure out what feels right for us. There's no rush, no timeline we have to follow. We can move as fast or as slow as you're comfortable with." Roy nodded, then smiled. "Can I tell you something that might sound crazy? Everything about tonight has been crazy. I think I can handle one more thing. I feel like I've been waiting my whole life for this conversation. Like, even before I understood what I was waiting for, some part of me knew that this moment was coming. Does that make sense?" Jeffrey thought about all the times over the past 2 years when he had caught Roy looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. All the moments of casual physical contact that had seemed to linger just a beat too long. All the conversations that had felt charged with unspoken meaning. Quote 124, he said. Quote 125, quote 126, Roy asked. Quote 127. Jeffrey considered lying or at least softening the truth, but Roy deserved honesty. Quote 128. Roy's expression grew serious. I'm sorry I made you wait so long. I'm sorry I put you through watching me with other people when you felt this way about me. You don't need to apologize, Jeffrey said firmly. You couldn't give me what you didn't know you had to give. And honestly, even if this had never happened, even if you had stayed straight forever, loving you would still have been worth it. You're worth it, Roy. Roy's eyes filled with tears, and he leaned forward to rest his forehead against Jeffrey's. I love you, he whispered. I'm in love with you. I should have said it earlier. But I was scared it was too much too fast. It's not too much, Jeffrey assured him, his own voice thick with emotion. I love you too. I've loved you for so long that it feels like part of who I am. They held each other then, not kissing, just breathing together in the quiet of Jeffrey's living room. Jeffrey felt like he was in a dream, like he might wake up at any moment and find himself alone in his bed, aching with the memory of something that had never actually happened. But Roy was solid and warm in his arms, real and present and choosing to be there. Roy asked eventually. Jeffrey said, Code 139. They moved to Jeffrey's bedroom, and Jeffrey felt a flutter of nervousness. They had been friends for years, had crashed at each other's places countless times. But this felt different. Everything felt different now that the truth was out in the open. Quote wondered. Roy said quickly, apparently reading Jeffrey's expression, I mean, I want to be close to you, but I'm not ready for anything more than that yet. Is that okay? That's more than okay, Jeffrey assured him. We go at your pace, remember? Always. They got ready for bed with a domesticity that felt both new and familiar. Roy borrowed a toothbrush and a t-shirt, and Jeffrey tried not to stare at the way the soft cotton clung to Roy's chest and shoulders. When they finally settled into Jeffrey's one, Roy curled against Jeffrey's side with a contentment that made Jeffrey's heart ache with happiness. This feels right, Roy murmured against Jeffrey's shoulder. Well to 145. Jeffrey pressed a kiss to the top of Roy's head, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo. Get some sleep, he said softly. We'll figure everything else out tomorrow. But Roy was already drifting off, his breathing evening out as he relaxed completely against Jeffrey's side. Jeffrey lay awake for a long time, hardly able to believe that this was his life now, that Roy was choosing to be here with him, that all of his careful hoping had somehow led to this moment. The next morning brought a brief moment of panic when Jeffrey woke up alone, his bed empty, and Roy nowhere to be seen. For a terrible instant, Jeffrey wondered if he had dreamed the entire conversation, if his subconscious had finally crafted a fantasy so vivid that it had felt completely real. But then he heard the sound of movement in the kitchen, and the smell of coffee drifted down the hallway. And Jeffrey realized that Roy hadn't left. He had just gotten up early. Jeffrey found Roy standing at the kitchen counter, fully dressed but with his hair still messed up from sleep, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He looked up when Jeffrey appeared in the doorway, and his face broke into a smile that was equal parts shy and radiant. Good morning, sir, Roy said softly. I hope you don't mind that I made coffee. I couldn't sleep anymore, but I didn't want to leave without seeing you. I definitely don't mind, Jeffrey said, accepting the mug Roy offered him. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Jeffrey felt that same electric jolt he had experienced the night before. How are you feeling? About everything, I mean. Roy considered the question seriously, taking a sip of his coffee before responding. Scared, Onate? He said honestly, but also more sure of myself than I've felt in years. Like, I keep waiting for the panic to set in, for some part of me to start screaming that I've made a huge mistake. But it's not happening. If anything, I feel calmer than I have in months. Jeffrey felt a rush of relief. He had been worried that Roy might wake up having second thoughts, that the clarity of the previous night might seem less clear in the harsh light of morning. I'm glad, he said simply. What about you, Roy asked. Any regrets about finally telling me how you feel? None, Jeffrey said immediately. Even if you had decided this morning that you wanted to pretend last night never happened, I would still be glad I told you. I was getting tired of carrying that secret around. Roy stepped closer, setting his coffee mug on the counter behind Jeffrey and effectively trapping him against the cabinets. Well, you don't have to carry it anymore, he said, his voice dropping to that soft, intimate tone that made Jeffrey's pulse quicken. Jeffrey asked, even though Roy's proximity and the look in his eyes made the answer pretty obvious. No, Roy confirmed, leaning in to brush his lips against Jeffrey's. The kiss was soft and sweet, tasting like coffee and morning and new possibilities. When they broke apart, Jeffrey was smiling so widely his face hurt. He said, Roy said, grinning back. They spent the morning talking, working through the practical aspects of their new relationship. Roy needed to officially end things with Emma, though they had been broken up for weeks and she was already seeing someone new. Jeffrey needed to tell his sister, who had been not so subtly asking when he was going to find someone special. They both needed to figure out how to navigate being a couple when they had been best friends for so long. Roy admitted as they sat across from each other at Jeffrey's small kitchen table, "Some of them are going to be surprised, but I think most of them will be happy for us. Julie Roberts has been making jokes about us being married for years." Jeffrey laughed. "She's going to be insufferably smug about being right." "Probably," Roy agreed, "but I don't care. Let her be smug. I'm too happy to care about anything else." The word happy seemed to glow in the air between them. Jeffrey reached across the table to take Roy's hand, marveling at how natural the gesture felt now that they didn't have to hide their feelings from each other. "I have to ask," Jeffrey said, "are you nervous about the physical stuff? I know last night was your first time kissing a man." Roy's cheeks flushed slightly, but he didn't pull his hand away. "A little, Mama," he admitted. "I mean, I've been thinking about it a lot, but thinking and doing are different things. I don't want to disappoint you." "You couldn't disappoint me," Jeffrey said firmly, "and there's no pressure to do anything you're not ready for. We have all the time in the world to figure it out." Roy nodded, then hesitated. "Can I tell you something embarrassing?" "Always. I've been researching, online, about what it's like to be with a man. I know that probably sounds ridiculous, but I wanted to have some idea of what I was getting into." Jeffrey tried not to smile at the image of Roy earnestly studying gay relationship advice on the internet. "What did you learn?" "That there's a lot more variety than I expected, and that the most important thing is communication and making sure both people are comfortable." Roy paused, then added quietly, "and that it's supposed to feel good for both people, not just one." "That's true for any relationship," Jeffrey said gently. "Gay, straight, or otherwise. It's about finding what works for the people involved." "I want to make you feel good," Roy said, his voice soft but determined. "I want to learn how to touch you, how to make you happy. I know I don't have experience, but I'm willing to learn." Jeffrey felt heat pool low in his stomach at Roy's words, but he kept his expression gentle and reassuring. "Quote 188, he said. Quote 189. They spent the rest of the morning in comfortable domesticity, reading the newspaper together, making breakfast, talking about their plans for the week. It felt remarkably natural, like they had been doing this for years instead of less than 24 hours. Jeffrey kept catching himself staring at Roy, hardly able to believe that this was his life now. It was around noon when Roy's phone rang, and Jeffrey watched Roy's expression shift from contentment to anxiety as he looked at the caller ID. Quote 189, Roy said quietly. Jeffrey felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, followed immediately by guilt. Emma was a nice person who had done nothing wrong except fall for someone who couldn't love her the way she deserved. "You should answer it," Jeffrey said. "She deserves to know that you are moving on." Roy nodded, then surprised Jeffrey by leaning over to kiss him quickly before answering the phone. "Hi, Emma," Roy said, and Jeffrey could hear the warmth and kindness in his voice. Even though their romantic relationship hadn't worked, Roy genuinely cared about Emma as a person. Jeffrey tried not to listen to the conversation, but in the small apartment it was impossible not to overhear. Emma was calling to return some books Roy had left at her place and to let him know that she was dating someone new. Jeffrey could hear the relief in both their voices as they talked, the sense that they were both finally in a place where they could be friends without all the weight of failed romantic expectations. "Go after," Roy said, and Jeffrey's heart skipped a beat. "Someone I've been friends with for a long time. It's still new, but it feels right in a way that nothing has felt right for me in years." Jeffrey couldn't hear Emma's response, but Roy laughed at whatever she said. "Yeah, you were right about that. I wasn't emotionally available because I was already emotionally invested elsewhere. I just didn't understand it at the time." The conversation wrapped up a few minutes later, with Emma wishing Roy well and Roy promising to stay in touch. When Roy hung up, he looked relieved and slightly emotional. "How do you feel?" Jeffrey asked. "Good," Roy said, settling back down next to Jeffrey on the couch. "Like I finally closed a chapter that needed to be closed. Emma's happy, I'm happy, and we can both move forward without any lingering weirdness." She seemed to take it well. She did. I think she knew, even before I did, that my heart wasn't fully in our relationship. She said she's not surprised that I ended up with someone I was already close to. Roy paused, then added with a small smile. She also said she hopes this person knows how lucky they are. Jeffrey felt a warm glow spread through his chest. "I do know," he said softly. "I know exactly how lucky I am." Roy kissed him then, slow and deep and full of promise. When they broke apart, Roy rested his forehead against Jeffrey's and said, quote, 205, quote, 206, Jeffrey replied, quote, 207. They spent the afternoon curled up together on Jeffrey's couch, watching movies and talking and occasionally kissing with the lazy contentment of people who finally had all the time in the world. Jeffrey kept thinking about how different this felt from his previous relationships, how easy and natural it was to be with Roy now that they didn't have to hide their feelings from each other. As evening approached, Roy grew quieter, more thoughtful. Jeffrey could see him working through something in his head, and he waited patiently for Roy to find the words for whatever he was thinking. "208," Roy said eventually. Quote Dawn in quote Ton, Roy paused, choosing his words carefully. Quote Dawn. Jeffrey considered the question thoughtfully. Quote to him. He looked at Roy seriously. Quote 239. Roy nodded, but Jeffrey could see that he was still working through something. Quote Twan them, Roy said quietly. Quote Twan, quote Twan. Jeffrey said gently, turning to face him fully. Quote Tom. Roy met his eyes, and Jeffrey could see the vulnerability and uncertainty there. "Why does," Jeffrey said firmly. Quote to one. Quote 20. Quote 20 on. Roy was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then he said, quote, 222, quote, 223, Jeffrey said immediately, quote, 224. Roy leaned against Jeffrey's side, and Jeffrey wrapped his arms around him. "I'm sorry I'm being so neurotic about this," Roy said. "I know you're being patient with me, and I appreciate it more than I can say." "You're not being neurotic," Jeffrey assured him. "You're being thoughtful and honest about what you need. That's exactly what you should be doing." They ordered dinner from their favorite Thai restaurant and ate it curled up on Jeffrey's couch, talking about everything and nothing. Jeffrey found himself cataloging every detail of the evening, the way Roy looked in the soft light from the lamp, the sound of his laugh, the casual way he reached over to steal bites of Jeffrey's pad thai. After 2 years of loving Roy from a distance, having him here like this felt almost too good to be true. "I should probably go home tonight," Roy said as they finished eating. "I need to shower and change clothes, and I have an early meeting tomorrow." Jeffrey felt a stab of disappointment, followed immediately by understanding. They were still figuring out how to navigate this new dynamic, and it made sense that Roy would want to maintain some normalcy while they adjusted. "Of course," Jeffrey said. "Do you want me to drive you?" "No, I can take the bus, but thank you." Roy hesitated, then added, "Can I see you tomorrow night? Maybe we could cook dinner together or go out somewhere if you want to be more public about this." Jeffrey's heart lifted. Quote 235. Roy smiled, then leaned over to kiss Jeffrey softly. Quote 223. Quote 237. Jeffrey said honestly. Quote 238. Roy's eyes filled with tears, and he kissed Jeffrey again, deeper this time. "I love you so much," he whispered against Jeffrey's lips. Quote 240. Quote Taurus, Jeffrey reminded him. Quote 242. After Roy left, Jeffrey cleaned up the dinner dishes and tried to process everything that had happened over the past 24 hours. His life had changed completely, in the best possible way, and he was still adjusting to the reality of it. Roy loved him. Roy wanted to be with him. All of Jeffrey's careful hoping and patient waiting had led to this moment, and it was more beautiful than anything he had imagined. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that felt both new and familiar. Roy would come over after work, or Jeffrey would go to Roy's place, and they would cook dinner together, watch movies, talk for hours about everything and nothing. They were learning how to be a couple, how to navigate the shift from friendship to romance, and Jeffrey was amazed by how natural it felt. They took things slowly, physically. Roy was eager to explore and learn, but he was also cautious, wanting to make sure each step felt right before moving to the next. Jeffrey was endlessly patient, following Roy's lead, letting him set the pace for their physical intimacy. They kissed often, long, slow kisses that left them both breathless and wanting more. Roy learned that he loved the feeling of the Jeffrey's hands in his hair, and Jeffrey discovered that Roy made the most incredible soft sounds when Jeffrey kissed his neck. Quote 243. Roy said one evening as they lay tangled together on Jeffrey's couch, "I thought kissing was just kissing. But with you, it's like an entire conversation that we're having with our mouths." Jeffrey laughed softly, pressing a kiss to Roy's temple. Quote 245. Quote Toda's son Roy said, his voice dropping to that intimate tone that never failed to make Jeffrey's pulse quicken. "We have plenty of time to figure that out," Jeffrey assured him, though his body was very interested in exploring those possibilities sooner rather than later. It was about 3 weeks into their relationship when Roy called Jeffrey at 2 in the morning, his voice shaky and vulnerable in the darkness. "I can't sleep," Roy said without preamble. "I keep lying here thinking about everything, about us, about how different my life is now. It's not bad thoughts, just overwhelming ones. I was wondering if maybe I could come over. I know it's late, but I really don't want to be alone right now." "Of course," Jeffrey said immediately, already getting out of bed to unlock his front door. "Come over. I'll be waiting." Roy arrived 20 minutes later, looking rumpled and emotional. He didn't say anything when Jeffrey opened the door, just walked straight into Jeffrey's arms and held on tight. Jeffrey could feel the tension in Roy's body, the way he was holding himself together through sheer force of will. Jeffrey asked gently, rubbing Roy's back in slow, soothing circles. "I had dinner with my parents tonight," Roy said, his voice muffled against Jeffrey's shoulder. 254. Jeffrey's heart ached for Roy. He had been out to his own family for years, but he remembered the fear and uncertainty that came with those first conversations. "What do you think they'll say?" he asked. "I don't know," Roy admitted. "They're not horrible people, but they're pretty traditional. They've never said anything overtly homophobic, but they've also never had to deal with having a gay son before. I keep imagining different scenarios, and some of them end with them accepting it, and some of them end with them cutting me off completely." Jeffrey held Roy tighter, wishing he could take away the fear and uncertainty. "Whatever happens, you won't be alone," he said firmly. "You have me, and you have friends who love you no matter what. Your family's reaction doesn't define your worth or the validity of our relationship." Roy pulled back to look at Jeffrey, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I know that logically, but emotionally it's terrifying. These are the people who raised me, who taught me how to be a person in the world. The thought of them rejecting this fundamental part of who I am is overwhelming." "It is overwhelming," Jeffrey agreed. "And it's okay to be scared, but you don't have to figure it all out tonight. You don't have to tell them anything until you're ready." Roy nodded, then said quietly, "Can I stay here tonight? I know we've been taking things slow, but I don't want to be alone with my thoughts. I just want to be close to you." "Of course you can stay," Jeffrey said, leading Roy toward the bedroom. "We don't have to do anything you're not ready for. I just want you to feel safe and loved." They got ready for bed together, the routine now familiar and comforting. Roy borrowed one of Jeffrey's t-shirts, and Jeffrey tried not to stare at the way it hung loose on Roy's frame, the way it made him look younger and more vulnerable. When they settled into bed, Roy curled against Jeffrey's side with a sigh of relief. Roy said softly. Jeffrey pressed a kiss to the top of Roy's head, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo. "You are home," he said. "Wherever we are together, that's home." They lay in comfortable silence for a while, Roy's breathing gradually evening out as he relaxed against Jeffrey's side. Just as Jeffrey was starting to drift off, Roy spoke again, his voice soft in the darkness. "Jeffrey? I've been thinking about what you said, about taking things at my own pace and not feeling pressured to do anything I'm not ready for." Jeffrey was instantly more awake, sensing that this conversation was heading somewhere important. "Yeah? I think I'm ready for more," Roy said quietly. "Not everything, not yet, but more than we've been doing. I want to touch you. I want to make you feel good. I want to learn what you like." Jeffrey's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice gentle and calm. Quote to 276. Quote 277. Roy said, shifting so he could look at Jeffrey's face in the dim light from the window. I've been thinking about it for days, imagining what it would be like. And tonight, when I was scared and overwhelmed about everything else, the thing that made me feel lighter was thinking about being close to you like that. Jeffrey reached up to cup Roy's face, his thumb brushing across Roy's cheekbone. Okay, he said softly. What do you want to try? Roy's cheeks flushed, but he didn't look away. I want to touch you. I want to see what you look like, what you feel like. I want to learn how to make you feel as good as you make me feel when you kiss me. Jeffrey felt heat pool low in his stomach, but he kept his focus on Roy's comfort and consent. Quote 282, he said. Quote 283. Quote aha sir, Roy agreed, then leaned down to kiss Jeffrey softly. Quote 280, quote Town, Jeffrey replied, then kissed Roy back with all the tenderness and passion he had been holding in check for weeks. What followed was slow and gentle and perfect. Roy's hands exploring Jeffrey's body with careful curiosity, Jeffrey guiding him with soft words and encouraging sounds. Roy was attentive and eager to learn, asking questions and paying attention to Jeffrey's responses, and Jeffrey felt overwhelmed by the love and care Roy put into every touch. When it was over, they lay tangled together, both breathing hard and smiling. Roy looked amazed and proud of himself, and Jeffrey felt like his heart might burst from the love and satisfaction coursing through him. That was incredible, Ryan, Roy said softly, pressing a kiss to Jeffrey's shoulder. John already quoted you I now known. Jeffrey agreed, pulling Roy closer. Roy was quiet for a moment, then said, quote 21. Jeffrey felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Quote to Quanaud. They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and Jeffrey woke up the next morning feeling more content and fulfilled than he had ever felt in his life. Roy was still sleeping, his face peaceful and relaxed, and Jeffrey had allowed himself a few minutes to just watch him, to marvel at the fact that this beautiful, wonderful man had chosen to be with him. The next few months passed in a blur of happiness and discovery. Roy gradually became more confident in his sexuality and in their relationship, and Jeffrey watched with amazement as Roy blossomed into someone more authentic and self-assured than he had ever been. They navigated the coming out process together, with Roy eventually telling his family and friends about their relationship. His parents took some time to adjust, but they ultimately came around, wanting their son to be happy more than they wanted him to fit their expectations. Roy moved into Jeffrey's apartment 6 months after that first night they spent together, and Jeffrey had never been happier to share his space with another person. They fell into domestic routines that felt both new and familiar, cooking together, doing laundry together, falling asleep in each other's arms every night. Quote 293, Roy said one evening as they lay in bed together. Quote Tone and Barn. Quote 295, Jeffrey said, running his fingers through Roy's hair. I'm glad you trusted me enough to reach out when you needed someone. It was more than that, though, Roy said thoughtfully. Even then, before I understood what I was feeling, some part of me knew that you were the person I wanted to be with when I was vulnerable and scared. You were the person who made me feel safe. Jeffrey kissed Roy's forehead, his heart full of love and gratitude. Cotoir smiled and shifted closer, pressing his face against Jeffrey's neck. Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't figured it out? If I had stayed in denial and kept trying to force myself into relationships that didn't fit? Sometimes, Jeffrey admitted, but I try not to dwell on it. We found our way to each other eventually, and that's what matters. I think I would have figured it out eventually anyway, Roy said. Maybe not as soon, maybe not in the same way, but I don't think I could have spent the rest of my life pretending to be someone I wasn't. The feelings I have for you are too strong, too fundamental to who I am. They would have found a way to the surface eventually. Jeffrey tightened his arms around Roy, overwhelmed by the love he felt for this man who had been brave enough to question everything he thought he knew about himself, who had been willing to risk everything for the chance to be authentic and happy. I'm proud of you, Jeffrey said softly. I know it wasn't easy, figuring all of this out, coming out to your family and friends, changing your whole understanding of yourself. But you did it, and you did it with so much grace and courage. Roy was quiet for a moment, then said, I couldn't have done it without you. You were so patient with me, to willing to let me figure things out at my own pace. You never pressured me or made me feel like I was taking too long or being too cautious. You just loved me and supported me and trusted that I would get there when I was ready. Because I knew you would, Jeffrey said simply. I could see how much you were struggling, how hard you were trying to understand yourself. I knew that if I just gave you space and time, you would figure it out. And what if I hadn't? What if I had decided that I was straight after all, that what I felt for you was just confusion or experimentation? Jeffrey considered the question seriously. Then I would have been heartbroken, but I would have respected your decision. Your happiness and authenticity are more important to me than my own feelings. If being straight had been your truth, then that's what I would have wanted for you. Roy lifted his head to look at Jeffrey, his eyes bright with emotion. How did I get so lucky to find someone who loves me like that? I'm the lucky one, Jeffrey replied, cupping Roy's face in his hands. Coat 344. Roy kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, Roy rested his forehead against Jeffrey's and said, I love you so much it sometimes feels like my heart can't contain it all. I know exactly what you mean, Jeffrey replied. Sometimes I look at you and I can't believe this is my life. That I get to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep in your arms every night. They lay in comfortable silence for a while, just holding each other and listening to the quiet sounds of the night outside their window. Jeffrey felt completely at peace, completely content in a way he had never experienced before Roy. All of his careful hoping, all of his patient waiting had led to this moment, this life, this love that felt too perfect to be real, but was somehow miraculously his. Jeffrey, Roy said softly. Hmm? Thank you for waiting for me. Thank you for seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Thank you for loving me even when I didn't know how to love myself. Jeffrey felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. Thank you for being brave enough to question everything you thought you knew. Thank you for choosing me, for choosing us, for choosing to be authentic even when it was scary. Roy smiled and settled back against Jeffrey's side, his breathing gradually evening out as he drifted toward sleep. Jeffrey lay awake for a little while longer, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this point. It hadn't been easy, and there had been moments when Jeffrey had wondered if his feelings would ever be reciprocated, if Roy would ever see him as more than just a friend. But love, Jeffrey had learned, wasn't just about the destination. It was about the journey, the patience, the willingness to support someone else's growth even when it was painful. It was about creating space for another person to become who they were meant to be, even if that process took longer than you hoped it would. Roy had needed time to understand himself, to question his assumptions, to find the courage to be authentic. Jeffrey had needed to learn how to love someone without expectations, how to be patient without being passive, how to hope without demanding. They had both grown and changed and become better versions of themselves through the process of finding each other. Now, lying in their shared bed in their shared apartment, listening to Roy's peaceful breathing and feeling the warmth of his body against his side, Jeffrey felt like the luckiest person in the world. Not because everything had been easy, but because it had been worth it. Every moment of uncertainty, every night of lying awake, wondering if Roy would ever see him the way he saw Roy, every careful conversation and patient explanation had led to this. Roy stirred slightly in his sleep, his arm tightening around Jeffrey's waist, and Jeffrey pressed a soft kiss to the top of his head. Tomorrow they would wake up together, make coffee together, start another day of the life they had built together. They would continue to grow and learn and discover new things about themselves and each other. They would face whatever challenges came their way as a team, supporting each other through the difficult moments and celebrating the joyful ones. But for now, in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Jeffrey simply held the man he loved and marveled at the beautiful, complicated, perfect journey that had brought them together. Sometimes the most incredible love stories were the ones that required patience, the ones that unfolded slowly over time, the ones that asked you to believe in something before you could see it clearly. Jeffrey had believed in Roy before Roy had believed in himself, and Roy had eventually found the courage to become the person he was meant to be. Together they had created something beautiful and lasting, something that honored both of their journeys while pointing toward a future full of possibility. As Jeffrey finally drifted off to sleep, Roy's hand warm against his chest and Roy's breath soft against his neck, he thought about how grateful he was for every moment that had led them here. The late-night phone calls, the vulnerable conversations, the first tentative kisses, the gradual building of trust and intimacy and love. All of it had been necessary. All of it had been worth it. All of it had been leading to this moment of perfect contentment and peace. In the morning, they would wake up together and start another day of their shared life, another day of loving each other openly and honestly and completely. But for now, they were simply two people who had found their way to each other through patience and courage and hope. Two people who had learned that the most beautiful love stories were often the ones that took the longest to unfold, the ones that required you to believe in something bigger than yourself, the ones that taught you that sometimes the most frightening dares led to the most beautiful discoveries. And in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, surrounded by the life they had built together, Jeffrey knew with absolute certainty that they were both exactly where they needed to be.